One of Ironhide's best ideas was the creation of Impossible Mode in Kingdom Rush Origins. It didn't just increase the health of enemies like it did in Vengeance and Imarines, it sometimes made significant changes to enemies' abilities. For instance, Gloomies could duplicate one more generation, which led to far more total Gloomies if left unchecked. Some enemies and bosses gained resistances, forcing you to pick your towers more carefully in order to beat them. On top of that, speed was universally increased for every enemy, further necessitating barracks. Damage was also increased for some enemies, making it crucial to not only buy barracks, but also upgrade them significantly. All in all, it did what a new difficulty mode should do. It gave a new experience that was engaging to people who were already experienced with the game. Thanks to the power of modding, it is now possible to implement an impossible difficulty for Kingdom Rush 1. And that's exactly what I have done, thanks to the invaluable help of Veznon Enjoyer. Introducing Kingdom Rush Impossible Mode, with 3 Bs, aka ImpossiBBBle mode. It's been difficult to keep up with the modding scene if you don't have time to watch every livestream or be on the Discord server for Kingdom Rush mods. My plan is to rectify that by going over everything there is to know about the changes made in Impossible Mode. First, some context. The modding scene began with the inclusion of towers from other games. So now modded Kingdom Rush 1 has all the towers from Frontiers and Origins. Frontiers has all the towers from 1 and Origins, and Origins has all the towers from 1 and Frontiers. With this in mind, I decided that it would be best to make 2 impossible modes, one for Kingdom Rush 1 towers only, and one with every tower option in mind. As things are, I can only have one or the other, so I decided to create the mode with every tower option in mind first. I wanted to create a mode for the veteran players, one that made you use every dirty trick in the book to win, barring abusing glitches. And to achieve this, I buffed the enemies and levels to the best of my ability. To begin, as you might expect, several enemies have had their HP increased. Most of these include the early game enemies like goblins, orcs, giant spiders, matriarchs, and wargs. Giant enemies have always felt too easy in this game, so to make players regard them more highly, they got the most significant HP boosts, as well as increased minimum damage on their attacks. Many enemies also have had their resistances boosted, to further encourage mage and archer interactions. Marauders and Dark Knights now have more armor. Demon Imps have magic resistance like all other demons now. Enemies like Darkslayers and Bandits deal even more damage. And to top it all off, almost every enemy has had their speed increased by 20% across the board. Exceptions include the flying enemies, who will keep the same speed, and some other entities that I'll get to later who have even more speed. Stat changes are simple to implement, but some other changes will bleed into the other difficulty modes. This was a price I was willing to pay for 2 reasons. One is that you can easily revert the changes of the mod by going back to the vanilla game. Reason 2 is that the interactions these lead to are too juicy to not implement. Spider matriarchs spawn more hatchlings, making them more threatening to deal with if you don't have good area damage. Necromancers can now spawn an unlimited number of skeletons rather than just 35. Demon Lord shields now take an additional hit, and the RNG of infernal combustion damage has been made static for all demons. Areas now have improved features as well. The graveyard in the Wastes and Dark Tower now has more depth. Instead of enemies with at least 300 HP spawning Skeleton Knights and nothing higher, now enemies with 700 HP spawn Necromancers. Enemies with 1000 HP spawn Magma Elementals. This leads to a significant change in the time when you want to use Rain of Fire and other abilities. With the buffs to Necromancers and Magma Elementals, this matters even more than what you may already be imagining. Magma Elementals also got a chance to shine on their own in Forsaken Valley, where they spawn much more frequently and with no initial cooldown anymore. The Dark Tower also spawns demons from the portals in more dangerous combinations. These changes stack with the buffed graveyard to make beating the level require a lot more thought. I've streamed myself beating every stage, including the heroic and iron challenges on impossible difficulty. This includes the elite stages, which were my main priority when making this mod. For this reason, I intend to go into much more detail about these levels than the summary I just did of the campaign stages. To do this, I'm sticking with my preferred method of relaying information, tier lists. I'm going to rank every elite stage, plus the Dark Tower, from easiest to hardest to 5-star. 5-starring means getting the 3 stars from the campaign, plus the 2 from the heroic and iron. Every stage should be difficult for a reason, and you're going to hear those reasons right now, starting with number 15, Nightfang Swale. Something has to be the easiest, and surprisingly this stage managed to be it. The enemies have been reworked to make it hard even when using every tower from every game. In the base game, Nightfang Swale Iron is arguably the hardest challenge in the series. So for this reason, I was reluctant to make the Lycans harder, especially since wargs were already buffed. As it is now, the new tower options available make the challenge still difficult, but not nearly as difficult as it once was. So it may seem like Lycans could stand to get a buff. However, the problem with buffing some of this campaign's enemies is the wave design, which I am not touching as a part of this difficulty. The enemy spawns are just too slow in this level in the campaign and heroic, which are already very easy. Buffing the enemies enough to make every challenge in the level difficult would make the harder levels that use these enemies too hard. So if you want to point the finger as to why this level isn't harder, blame Castle Blackburn for making use of these enemies in ways that would be impossible to balance. Ironhide balanced themselves into a corner, both in the original game and in Impossible mode. I did still manage to squeeze in significant buffs to Were-Rats, who now have more speed, armor, and health. I also gave a slight health buff to Black Hags, but again, I couldn't buff them too much without making Castle Blackburn too hard. Number 14. Ancient Necropolis. Like the previous level on this list, buffing the enemies in this level would simply make the other levels that use them impossible. This time, it's the Fallen and Spectral Knights that I can't make harder. I already buffed them significantly in the mod, and had to nerf them just to make Castle Blackburn heroic physically possible. So this is another stage that suffers from the success of the other levels. However, this one ranks above Knifing Swill thanks to the genuinely difficult heroic challenge. This one was already pretty tough in the base game, but with the speed boosts to enemies, everything is tougher, especially the wargs. Other than that, the campaign takes the longest out of any stage. It's the slowest speedrun stage in the series, which hasn't changed even with the help of other towers. The iron is the most trivialized part of this, thanks to the power of assassins. At this point, the value of a tier list in selling this mod has become more than questionable, but trust me, you want to hear the rest of the changes in this mod, starting with number 13, Hushwood. The first changes in Impossible mode are actually changes that should have existed in the vanilla game in the first place. For instance, raiders now take 3 lives when they used to only take 1. Pillagers now deal magic damage when they used to deal physical damage despite what the description said. For the rest of the changes, every enemy is stronger with more health and sometimes more armor. Along with the universal speed boost, the toughest part of this stage is building up a solid choke point that still defends the early waves of wolves and gargoyles. It's a lot more rewarding to actually get this choke point established now that the final waves of enemies have so much HP to chew through. It's a fun self-imposed challenge to see how effectively you can beat them without selling any towers or losing any lives. This was my bare minimum for every stage, and what I balanced Impossible mode around. The heroic and iron challenges are sort of the same story, with the iron now being especially important to utilize true damage in thanks to the EHP of armored enemies. Number 12, Ruins of Akaroth. The first boss stage in this list. Akaroth was always one of the easier elite stages for me, so it gave me a ton of leeway to buff enemies. First, the Orc champions now have great armor, sitting at a comfortable 95%. They also have more health, so that you want to go for magic damage rather than true damage, since magic damage tends to be higher at the cost of more universal application. Warg Riders also have more health and more magic resistance, making it important to have a mix of both damage types by wave 15, or a sufficient amount of true damage to deal with that much health. As much as I would like to force the need for insta-kills against forest trolls, somehow giving them 10,000 HP from 4,000 wasn't enough, as you can still burst them down with enough raw power. This is actually a good thing, as you will need to make sure you can also burst down Golthak, who has way more HP, a global range heal ability, and faster movement speed. The heroic and iron challenges can get really clutch towards the end too. Those two are just the right difficulty to beat in 1 to 2 tries if you really know what you're doing. Number 11, Rotwick. What was once the worst and easiest stage in the game has been modified significantly, but only in the campaign. This level now has updated corpse piles, which spawn enemies periodically throughout most of the waves. This is one of the only times that I've affected which enemies will show up in a level, but I figured that it was okay to do this for Rotwick since nobody cares about this level. It's only the campaign that's hard now, but man is it tight. Imagine something slightly less demanding than Knifing Swill Iron with just the base game towers, but for 15 waves. Once you get to the end, it might look like endless mode, so have fun building the optimal area damage setup to obliterate the new spawns with. Number 10, Bandit's Lair. The second boss stage on this list, and ironically, one of the hardest bosses that I've created, at least for a first try run. The Kingpin has not only had a significant health boost, but he has also had a massive speed boost, making it necessary to pull every stop at slowing him down in order to sufficiently damage him. Or you can try your luck at bursting him down with enough firepower, but the requirements to do so will eat into your gold spent pretty early on into the level. You have to find the cheapest defense against the early waves in order to afford a defense for the boss to come. I actually found the campaign part of this level to be in the top 5 hardest campaigns in Impossible, but the medium difficulty heroic and overly easy iron hold this one back from ranking higher. Number 9. The Dark Tower. This is the only other level where I modified the enemies that spawn in this stage. The bottom portal on the map now spawns 7 demon hounds every time, forcing you to have a barracks setup that will not die to this much damage constantly being dealt to them or this many units constantly going through. It also requires you to defend against the graveyard, buffed rocket riders, buffed matriarchs, buffed necromancers, and buffed magma elementals, all for a chance against the final boss, Veznon. As it turns out, there are multiple ways to tackle this boss battle, so it's not nearly impossible. All it takes is building a strategy that can combine boss damage and stalling with the blocking power and crowd control needed to deal with the bottom half of the map. It also turns the boss fight into a race to get to phase 2, as that's when the portals and therefore the graveyard stop spawning enemies. What really steals this level's place on the list, however, is the Iron Challenge. This is the most fun I've ever had on a Kingdom Rush stage, all thanks to the removal of artillery. Balancing a defense that can hold against a graveyard, plus the flying enemies in the middle of the stage, is a true test of skill. The elementals matter so much in this challenge, but it makes micro so much more rewarding. Beating Dark Tower Iron on Impossible puts you in a higher caliber of skill compared to the players who haven't done this yet. Number 8. Serogaz's Lair. Another contender for the top 5 hardest campaigns in Impossible. Serogaz's Lair took me many tries to get right. As it turns out, there are alternative solutions to my strategy, but nonetheless, it takes a lot to get through this with no lives lost. Sons of Serogaz have 3000 HP now, as well as great armor and magic resistance, forcing you to find a way to deal with them. In the base game, you could still brute force your way through their HP with Teslas or Shrapnel Shot. In the mod, they're too tough to beat with brute force now. Another part of this level that is much harder is the Yeti wave midway through. After defending against buffed Necromancers, buffed Darkslayers, and finally buffed Rocket Riders, you now need the firepower to beat Yetis with 4000 HP and 100 to 150 damage per attack. All of this while still preparing defenses that can stand against spiders with dual resistances. The boss Serogaz doesn't have much more HP, as buffing her any further would lead to a slogfest of perma-stalling a boss while the boss wave has already finished sending out enemies. So instead, you have to find a way to deal damage to this HP sponge who now also has dual resistances. Good luck. And then there's the Iron Challenge, which also took me an insane number of tries because I kept trying to force a certain barrack setup to work. This level earns its ranking for being similar to the Dark Tower for a difficult campaign and difficult iron, but beats it out for having a harder sum total. Number 7. Glacial Heights. One enemy faction that I didn't mention the buffs for was the Trolls. This is because the Trolls buffs are pretty tame in the campaign. Basic Trolls have a little more HP and that's it. This is because buffing them any further makes Glacial Heights Iron, which is already one of the toughest stages in the series, literally impossible. However, there are 3 more troll buffs that make a big difference. First, Pathfinders now have even more minimum damage, so you better be able to block them with good barracks or else they will plow through your weaker soldiers. Second, Breakers now have even more HP, making it all the tougher to kill them without an insta-kill. Third, Chieftains are now able to buff Troll Breakers with their drums, just like they could on Flash. This sets the Breaker's armor to immune for the duration of the buff, which is 6 seconds, as well as making them very hard to stall. Your micro needs to be on its A game in order to deal with both of the enemies introduced in this elite stage. Number 6. Hawkcrouch Plateau. Your micro also needs to be on its A game for this elite stage. While I found Glacial Heights Iron to be tougher than anything else in this stage, the combination of the campaign, heroic, and iron all still being very difficult is what secured Hawkcrouch Plateau a higher spot on the list. Olga Kai has a massive HP pool and tons of damage. His damage is actually what makes him the most dangerous, because it works in conjunction with his gimmick of being invincible while moving. So you have to block him, but you can only do it with the very toughest of soldiers, and even then, he can still easily break through your defenses without careful micro, which makes this boss truly threatening. With the stat buffs to the regular troll enemies, the heroic and iron challenges are as hard as they can be without making me lose my sanity. But they came very close, because I was so torn on what towers to focus on to counter each threat that these challenges posed for me. This is true ImpossiBBBle mode. Number 5. Pandemonium. What can I say about Pandemonium? Everyone regards it as peak Kingdom Rush difficulty. There were very little buffs that I could make to the demons, or else the heroic and iron challenges would be way too hard. What I did manage to squeeze in were buffs to Goliathmons, giving them more HP, buffs to legions, allowing them to duplicate by one more generation, and more HP for Cerberus. As for the boss, Moloch has had a damage and health boost. Stalling him is way harder, while killing him early is just impossible, forcing you to contend with his Demon Legion army simultaneously. Top it off with a very tough iron challenge and a very demanding heroic challenge, and you have the first in the top 5 hardest stages in Impossible mode. Number 4. Pit of Fire. Now a reverse of how Glacial Heights and Hot Crush Plateau were ranked, all because of that heroic challenge. This one took me so many tries that it melted my brain. I stopped playing as well from trying so many times at the same thing, making so many slight variations to my strategy. I actually needed to take a step away and brainstorm what I was going to do, and even then I still needed to practice and refine my approach. Pit of Fire Heroic carries this entire level to number 4. Number 3. Fungal Forest. The trend of the hardest stages in the base game remaining hard in the mod continues. Ideally, every stage would be about equal in difficulty, but it turns out that some heroics and irons are just too rough if you buff the campaigns too much. Not Fungal Forest though. Instead, everything is equally too hard, requiring a ton of precise micro or using exclusively the most powerful tower combinations in order to win. While rot shrooms haven't been buffed at all, every other enemy has been. Husks have 400 HP and 10 to 15 damage. Swamp Things have 4,500 HP and 100 to 150 damage like other giants. Noxious Creepers have 1,600 HP. Tainted Treants have 2,000 HP and faster movement speed. Mechanid is both tankier and deals more damage. All of these things combine to make the stage harder in the campaign, heroic, and iron. But it's all still doable after enough retries. Number 2. Rotten Forest. I actually thought this level was too easy in the base game. Once you realize that the poison pool punished the death of units, you would just beat the stage with only damage towers. This actually trained me to rarely ever use barracks even in other stages, which has shaped my playstyle for all Kingdom Rush games. So the Rotten Forest comes so naturally to me that I need significant buffs to make it hard like it should be. First, the universal speed buff to enemies should make barracks feel a little more necessary, but mainly it's the buff to tree and HP that makes barracks a much bigger help. They're a little too tanky for teleport to work on them enough times, plus a little too fast, leading to you getting overwhelmed if you lack proper stalling power. However, the poison pool is also stronger. Should you let units with more than 200 HP die, the poison pool will spawn Noxious Creepers. This makes it crucial to keep the troops used for stalling upgraded highly enough that they can actually tank against the hordes coming their way. This becomes even more prudent once Greenmuck spawns in, who is one of the hardest bosses in the vanilla game. Then there's the Iron Challenge. A wise man once said, "This seems hard." That man is wise because his observation is correct. Rotten Forest Iron on Impossible is hard. Number 1. Castle Blackburn. In all my playtesting, this was the only stage that forced me to make nerfs to the Impossible mode changes in order to make it physically beatable. I try to keep my nerfs to a minimum in order to retain the difficulty as much as possible. To begin, we have a campaign that is strictly harder than the original. Enemies are faster, Black Hags are tankier, Fallen and Spectral Knights deal more damage, Spectral Knights have 800 HP, and Blackburn is an absolute menace. There's a reason I didn't buff Abominations or any of the werewolf enemies. The level has some breathing room for players when the werewolves and Lycans spawn, though it's still the hardest campaign stage on Impossible. Lord Blackburn, being like a larger Fallen Knight, has been buffed to have immunity to both magic and physical damage, only being vulnerable to true damage or resistance reduction, like through Arcane Archers and Kingdom Rush 1 mages. Then there's the Heroic Challenge. This is the reason that I had to nerf Spectral Knights, who originally had 1000 HP, and even then, the solution to the Heroic is so obscure that you'd probably exhaust most of the options before ever finding it. The only part of this level that's easy is the Iron, but it's so brief compared to the trial and error of the campaign and Heroic that this stage more than easily earns its rank at number 1. These challenges are all possible, though the difficulty might make them seem less so. However, I genuinely recommend playing this mod. I feel like I became a much better player having gone through every level. I understood the roles of towers better, and even learned to appreciate towers I once thought were bad. I can't guarantee that every Heroic and Iron in the main campaign is doable, but these are the sacrifices I was willing to make in order to provide a more interesting main campaign and post-game experience. One elephant in the room is that these towers and heroes have been rebalanced to make them all equally close to being useful. I don't want the balance changes to get in the way of what people were hoping for in an all towers mod, nor in an impossible mode. I wanted the opposite in fact, where this would make the mode even better by giving each tower a chance to be viable, allowing you to form some really interesting strategies. All that I can ask of people who are let down by the balance changes is to give the mod a try with these changes and see if you end up liking it better. Some changes are purely for quality of life, so I'm sure those will make a positive impact. There are so many challenges left to be done with these mods that it's insane. Cozy Nez has an amazingly well-made video beating an early version of Impossible mode with Kingdom Rush 1 towers only. I hope that that isn't the only quality video made in the wake of modding, but rather the first domino to fall in the resurgence of Kingdom Rush. I don't know how many other ways I can say that there's a ton of fun to be had here. So if you want access to the mods, join my Discord server to have the link ready and a place to give feedback on all of the mods changes. I will also have a link in the description of the video for you to directly access Impossible mode. Some things to note if you're having trouble playing the mod. Casual difficulty and HD instead of full HD cause errors, so don't play on either of those settings. Additionally, if you have an illegitimate copy of the game, the mods will not work. You need to own the game on Steam in order to replace the exe file with the one downloaded from the link in the description. If it says that the link is a virus, I promise that it's not. This is just the result of such a massive file that it immediately seems untrustworthy to the computer, as if it's a zip bomb. Trust me, I know way too little about technology to pull something like that off, even if I wanted to. Anyways, good luck with installing the mod. I still believe that we are on the verge of a Kingdom Rush resurgence, but it's going to take the effort from others to make quality videos out of the mods. Look forward to what more is to come, because I see some big things in the future.